3.
Hey, welcome to the Green Bay Botanical Gardens. My name is Michael. I'm Fall Education Intern, continuing our Wednesday Fall Facebook Live series. And if you haven't noticed, fall is definitely here. In fact, I'd go so far as to say winter's probably more on the way at this point. It is starting to get really cold. Not but a couple weeks ago, out in our children's garden, we saw some bumblebees still buzzing around on the marigolds, and now the bee activity is very, very low, if any are left out there. So it's starting to get very cold, under freezing. And last week we talked about some of the adaptations that plants have to deal with the cold. This week we're going to be focusing on animal adaptations to deal with the cold, where the mammals go when it gets cold, as well as what animals you might expect to see here at the garden in the winter and throughout the year. So hopefully you'll enjoy joining me on this journey. If you've noticed, I've got my winter coat on, which I was very hesitant to break out, but I finally did to keep me warm. Animals don't always have that option of being able to put on extra layers for the cold. And the winter presents a lot of serious challenges. The temperature, the wind, there's a lack of food and resources during the winter. So animals need some different ways to deal with that. The first group I'd like to cover today are mammals, the furry critters, dogs, cats, other wild mammals that we're going to start to get into. And I think the most iconic of all fall mammals are the squirrels. We've got 2 species of flying squirrels, 2 species of ground squirrel, 2 species of chipmunk, and 3 species of tree squirrel here in Wisconsin. Most people just think of the tree squirrels, the big bushy-tailed ones. And they have a really interesting way of getting ready for the winter. They are usually stockpiling food like acorns, nuts, and seeds as much as they can before the winter hits. Their survival strategy to get through the winter is to stockpile as much food as they can. Since they're going to not really go to sleep too much through the winter, they're still going to be somewhat active. Having as much food as possible really helps them out. Beavers will actually do the same thing. So beavers are eating woody materials, they're eating aquatic plants. They will actually stockpile things like twigs before the winter hits to help them have a good store of food when the food is going to be a lot harder to find. Deer likewise are active during the winter. They don't really do a whole lot that's special at all other than trying to roam around and find good spots for food. So you can still see deer being active during the winter, and it's a lot tougher for them since there's less food available and they really have to search harder to find good spots of it. Many animals are well known for something called hibernation, which is pretty awesome of them. And hibernation is essentially like a deep sleep. They'll typically go into hibernation for a period of a couple weeks, or maybe even a month or so, and that is essentially really deep sleep. What hibernation does is it helps them save a lot of energy. When food's harder to find, you can stockpile your food, or you can just use less of it. And by hibernating, the animal lowers its heart rate, its breathing rate, it lowers its body temperature significantly. Hibernating animals can lower their body temperature by as much as about 30 degrees or so. So they're essentially reducing all of their metabolism, how much energy they're using to be able to last through the winter. And animals like chipmunks and groundhogs are typical hibernators that you'll find. Well, you probably won't actually find them since most hibernators are going to be finding a den or a spot underground. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to fall asleep out in the open because you'd be vulnerable to the wind or a predator that might come by and try and eat you. So you probably won't find them, but rest assured, they're hibernating. Likewise to hibernation, there's something called torpor, which is really similar, but a little different. And bears and badgers will actually go into torpor. At least bears in Wisconsin will. Torpor is a state of reduced metabolic activity, like hibernation, but it's essentially hibernation light. Instead of reducing their body temperature by a lot, it might just be by a little. Instead of really reducing their heart rate and their breathing, they'll make it a little more shallow. And instead of being asleep for weeks, they can actually wake up a lot more quickly. And they might only go into torpor for a day or two or a couple days and then be active and then go back into torpor. So it helps them be a little more active while still saving energy. And we've got a lot of cool mammals here at the garden, but they're not always helpful for us because we've got a lot of beautiful display beds, and these animals in tough times are looking for a meal. Deer will typically try and browse our trees, our display beds, our hostas. Chipmunks will dig up bulbs, and we need to be able to spray for them with environmentally safe sprays. Their rabbits will munch on anything they can really find. They are frequent munchers, and they'll actually chew some of our cords for garden of lights that we're setting up for. Groundhogs will dig up some of our vegetables in our gardens, and mice will try and get into buildings where it's warm. If you have a home, you might be familiar with mice trying to get in as well. And we don't want them to be scurrying about, so we try and keep them out the best we can. So these mammals are all looking for somewhere warm to go. Some will hibernate, and some will just try and make it through the winter or stockpile food. I've actually got some cool mammal-related things I'd like to show you over here. A little bit down this way. It's right up in the trees, and it's something I learned fairly recently. I love to be able to share with people. If you look up there in those trees, we've actually got some, I'm pretty sure, I'm not positive on this ID, but I'm pretty sure they are squirrel nests. And you can tell their squirrel nests look really similar to bird nests, but typically they're a bit more round and a bit larger. And that is some squirrels will nest in cavities of trees, but others will actually just construct nests called drays to kind of tough out throughout the winter and have a place to go back to. So those are some really interesting squirrel drays, and those are some of the mammals that we have here. We luckily don't have bears. I haven't run into any yet, but most of the other ones I've mentioned today, like chipmunks and deer and groundhogs, you'll find around here. So I'd like to begin walking a little farther down this way while we talk. The next group I'd like to move on to are birds. We have a lot of beautiful birds here in the Green Bay Botanical Gardens, and they've got a couple different winter survival strategies as well. Most people are familiar with the two big ones, which are either that they're going to try and survive through the winter, or they are going to migrate out of the coldest possible areas. Those are two ways you can either avoid the cold or you can try and make it through. And winter is a tough season for birds. It's harder for them to be able to find food. It's windy, it's colder. It's not an easy place or time for them to be in. But throughout the season, we've got a lot of beautiful birds here. I have seen throughout the summer and the spring, I got to do some bird watching here. I got to see jays, cardinals, and Baltimore Orioles, so your reds, your blues, your oranges. I got to see ruby-throated hummingbirds, green and red. I got to see some mallards, I've seen a lot of sandhill cranes this year in the area, although I don't know if they're here at the garden particularly, but I wouldn't be surprised since they're often looking for a meal. And we've also got gray catbirds, which I actually saw one of this morning, and I hear them all the time. And some of these birds, like the jays and the cardinals, are not migratory, so they will be staying throughout the winter, whereas other ones, like the orioles and some of our more colorful warblers and hummingbirds, are going to be migrating and moving to warmer areas. In the winter, some of the most common birds we'll see are the cardinals, are seen everywhere. We also have birds like dark-eyed juncos looking for seeds, and I saw some sparrows this morning on the way in, and we've also got some goldfinches that still don't migrate out of Wisconsin and add kind of a splash of color during the drab winter season. So those are some of the winter birds we have, and interestingly enough, most people think migration happens by species, and it usually does. But even within a species, some birds will migrate or choose not to migrate depending on where they are. A good example is the Cooper's hawk, which in the northern part of Wisconsin might migrate south, but in the more southern part of Wisconsin can be found there year-round. So it's really interesting that some birds will migrate and some will choose not to, just based on where they are, even within the same kind of species. So those are some of the ways that birds are going to be dealing with the cold, and I'd like to continue walking here because I found something really interesting on one of our trails here. A lot of times when you're looking for animals in the wild, you won't often see the animal, but you can see some of the signs that they leave behind, like prints or tracks. And we've actually got some tracks here if you want to zoom in a little bit. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but that track seems to be about groundhog sized or so. So a groundhog, or I'm thinking possibly a muskrat, was probably digging around here near a pond trail, looking for things to eat and munch on. And they'll often be, both will be found near water. Water is a good resource for animals to use, especially during the winter when things are less available to them. There's, snow and ice will be freezing things. They're going to need to be able to find things to be able to rely on, like a body of water, or water that's still moving and accessible to them. For our next animal group, I'd like to cover insects. Well, I actually had to do some research into insects because I wasn't as familiar with what insects do during the winter. I'd imagine a lot of you at home might also not be familiar with what insects are going to be doing during the winter. And I brought us to our pond because during the summer I got to see a beautiful sight of some of our blue dragonfly species, which I'm pretty sure are either blue darters or great blue skimmers, dashing around over the pond looking for a meal. And they're not here anymore. Insects have a couple different ways of dealing with the cold. Some of them will go underground, and others, like the dragonflies, will just die off. Some dragonflies actually can migrate, but most of them will simply lay their eggs or have their larvae, and then the adult form will die off. Because sometimes when you're an insect and you're not very long-lived, you can't generate your own heat, so you're not warm-blooded, and you're small and you've got a lot of surface area to the cold, it's just easier to just pass on to the next generation rather than trying to truck through the winter. Bumblebees are one of my favorite, and I did see them earlier in the season, and they've got a really interesting way of dealing with the winter, which is that essentially the whole colony will die off. And bumblebee colonies are smaller than honeybee colonies, but they can still be sizable of a couple hundred bees. The colony will die off except for one, the queen. The queen will be fertilized before the winter hits, and then after the winter in the spring, she'll emerge. She essentially goes into kind of a hibernation-like state throughout the winter, and then when spring happens, she emerges. She will go strike off and try and find resources to go build a new colony and lay eggs that essentially will be new bees to help her out building this colony. So essentially the queen is the only one that survives the winter. In addition to bees and dragonflies, we've also got moths and butterflies here. I've seen a lot of the woolly bear caterpillars, which grow into the Isabella tiger moths. I've definitely seen a lot of those around, and those caterpillars are super cold resistant, a lot more than a lot of other insects, and that's probably why you will see them being active even decently late into the fall. I'm pretty sure that was a catbird. Might have been the same one I saw earlier, if you were able to hear that home. But butterflies are well known for migrating, although some actually can overwinter. The monarch and the red admiral are migrators, whereas ones like the the mourning cloak and the gray comma are actually able to go into a diapause state and troop through the winter. And then when it gets warm, they become more active and more lively again. I've actually heard from the research sources I was looking into that those butterflies, if it gets warm enough, even on a snowy day, you can see them flying over snow hills, which is a sight I would consider myself blessed to be able to see in my lifetime, a butterfly over a snowy hill. So those are some of the ways that insects are dealing with the cold temperatures. A lot of them will die off. Some will try and go into a hibernation-like state, and rarely they will try and migrate. Our final group that I'd like to talk about today, and this is the perfect spot for them, are the reptiles and amphibians, so turtles, snakes, and frogs. They're typically going to be found around water, especially the amphibians and the turtles, and that is helpful for them because both the water and the mud act as a buffer to the cold temperature. So under the water it's going to be a bit warmer than it will up on the air, and even deeper under the mud it's going to be even warmer. So turtles, using their claws, can dig down into the mud to be able to stay warm throughout the winter season. Whereas amphibians have some really cool adaptations. Frogs actually can freeze safely. Kind of like we talked about last week with plants, they can move fluid out of their cells so it won't damage them if they freeze, and they can essentially thaw out and kind of come back to life. They're not really dead. They are simply frozen in a safe way that doesn't damage them. Some frogs actually can create their own antifreeze too by concentrating different fluids within their body and allowing their cells in their body to not freeze over the winter. And they will likewise often burrow in mud just to try and stay as warm as they can. Snakes you probably won't see around here too much anymore, especially with the cold season. Being a reptile, being cold-blooded, it's hard because when the temperature drops, so does your activity level. They'll, similar to mammals, try and find dens or burrows that they can hide out in and try and stay warm. They'll essentially go into a hibernation or torpor-like state to ride out the winter as well. And interestingly enough, even though a lot of snakes are solitary, they will sometimes group together in dens to help share body heat and stay warm throughout the winter season. So those are some of the awesome animals that you might see here at the garden, and that's some of the places that they go during the winter when you walk around and you say, hey, there aren't quite as many animals out here anymore. To recap, some of the mammals will be finding food, stashing it, or hibernating. Some just deal with the winter by still being out. Birds often will migrate, or they will try and troop through the winter too. Insects might die off. They might migrate, or they might go into the ground and try and ride out the winter there, or they might just leave it to the next generation by dying off. And then reptiles and amphibians often like to go into the mud or into dens to try and stay warm, and frogs have some frogs have cool adaptations that help prevent freezing. That was pretty much all I have for today. I am going to stay warm for the winter season. Since I'm a human, I'm going to be out shopping for some new thermals this season to help keep myself warm. I'd love to hear what you all are doing at home to keep yourselves warm too. And if you've seen any of these animals out and about, feel free to post them in the comments. And I'd love to see you at our next Facebook Live the week after next week. We will be tackling a new topic. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope you have an awesome day. Feel free to come see the gardens. You might spot some animals. The birds are definitely out.